Okay, 2 o'clock straight up. Hi, guys. Can everybody see my screen here? Give me a thumbs up, Susan Smart, if you can see it. Okay, perfect. So today we're going to go 30 minutes or thereabouts. I've got slated pages 3 through 7. There's quite a bit of information, so we may not get through page 7. If it seems right, we'll go for it. Otherwise, we'll cut it off at page 6. So we'll do page 3, 4, 5, and 6 today. And then we'll finish up with the final session in part 3. So first up, we're going to be page 3. We're going to talk about paragraph 7. And so what paragraph 7 is all about is who pays for the minimum mandatory government inspections, if there are any. Typically, we find that we don't have any minimum mandatory government inspections in the mountain communities for the most part. So it's a paragraph that isn't used very often. I need to mute whoever that is.
It has like a whole different name, so I'm not sure if it's still the same listing or should I actually...
Go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question. So we typically, as I said, we don't have, it's not something that is addressed typically in our contracts. The next paragraph is who pays for compliance with any government retrofit standards. Again, mountain communities, we don't have, some communities have low flow toilets or something else that is mandated as a point of sale issue, and we don't have those. And so typically if those boxes are checked because it's an out of area broker in some instances, I usually counter, and I'll counter that that those are not, first of all, they don't apply, so they're not applicable in our contract. And secondly, the reason for that is that there typically aren't any of those that apply in the mountain communities. Bar to be provided copies of any required government conducted or point of sale inspection reports. Again, if there is inspections, if there is point of sale issues that you're dealing with, which in a lot of places in California there are. If there is a report that's generated by LACSD or some other utility or entity, maybe it's a local building inspection or something like that, then the paragraph states that the buyer is to be provided copies of those. The next paragraph C has to do with escrow and title. So they're identified and by name, and it also identifies who is to be paying for them. Typically under escrow, you'll have both boxes checked, buyer and seller shall pay for escrow. And then I typically write in something like each to pay their customary fees, something like that. And then specify the escrow holder shall be whoever that person is that you're designating. We're seeing in a lot of offers now that the escrow holder will be seller's choice. And if there's going to be a counter, typically, I will counter in the counter offer identifying. If a buyer gives me an offer that says seller's choice, I will counter and just identify who escrow is. Same thing with title. I'll counter who title is. And you'll find in most instances that the box is checked for the seller to provide the owner's title policy. That's a negotiable item. Okay, it's customary in the state of California, or at least in our market areas, that the seller pays for that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that the seller pays for that. It could be something that if the buyer wants to sweeten the deal and make their offer more appealing, they could check the box stating that they are going to pay for it rather than the seller pay for it. I'll point out something that if the title company is a title company that you don't like, for example, let's say they write in XYZ title company and you're not familiar with them, you have to be careful with countering that, because you may get an objection from a buyer's agent, and they may state something like it's illegal for the seller to dictate who the title company is. You don't find that very often. I still counter with the title company that I want, but if it becomes a pissing contest, excuse my French, that is actually accurate. That that it is not legal for the seller to dictate who the title company is going to be. So that's just kind of a strange nuance with regard to title. Okay, page 3. So we paragraph 7. Continued other costs, county transfer, HOA fee, HOA transfer. The seller defaults for the HOA documents, and you'll see that somewhere else in the actual contract with timelines. The buyer defaults for the homeowner certification, private transfer fee, space for some other transfer fee. So if there's some other unusual transfer fee in our area here, if there's an ALA transfer fee or a dock transfer fee, or if there is some other private water transfer fee, that would be listed there. And basically all you're doing is identifying who's paying for those. The last item is who's paying for, or if there is a home warranty. So you check the box if the buyer is waiving the requirement for a home warranty. Be specific with regard to the home warranty if you're writing the offer, so that you make sure that you get the appropriate coverage that you need. Paragraph 8, items included in and excluded from the sale, even if it's in the marketing materials. This is something that I hear frequently. You go to close the transaction and there's something that was listed in the flyer, for example, that it had this amenity. Maybe it's a special barbecue or a special patio set, or something that traditionally would be normal personal property. It's not a fixture on the property, but it's listed in the marketing materials. And so the buyer assumes that because it was in the marketing materials and maybe it was in the MLS printout, that it's included. And they get upset when it's not included. So what you need to remember is that anything that is not part of the property, anything that's not a fixture that is typically included, is not included unless you specifically agree to it in the agreement. So there needs to be something in writing that says that the spa tub, for example, so beautiful spa tub, let's say it makes the back patio area. It's one of those movable ones. And it's listed in all the marketing materials. It's listed in the MLS printout. Guess what? If it's not negotiated into the deal, the seller can take it, and the buyer is going to be out under those circumstances. They become very upset by that because they believe that everything that is listed in the marketing materials is typically what's included in the transaction. So that is a common thing that comes up frequently. Still on page 3, paragraph 8. Items included in the sale: fixtures and fittings attached to the property, all that you would expect, including gas logs and grates, awnings, window coverings, trees and shrubs, water features and fountains, water purifiers, and any checked items, all stoves, refrigerators, washers, and dryers, right? So those items need to be checked if they are included, but the normal fixtures, the normal things. We had a transaction a few years ago where there were some bears, some carved bears that were sitting on top of tree stumps in the front yard. They were very expensive pieces. They were actually chained to the wood stumps. The seller took them. The buyer was absolutely irate, and it blew up the deal basically because they expected that those bears were going to remain because they were chained, they were fixed to the property that they were to be included, when in fact they weren't. There's a separate line for anything someone wants to be specific about. I'd recommend that you use an addendum and not use that separate line, but just include an addendum to include more specifically, and be specific about everything that really matters to that buyer. I would be asking those questions.
Hey, Steve, can I ask you a quick question?
Of course.
So I had an issue with a nest one time, and it turns out that the seller just ended up taking it. And it was a big deal for the buyer, so it became an issue. But is a nest, because that's an integrated system.
It is, yeah, it is.
So
it is included.
Stay.
It would be included.
Right.
That is something that is considered that would be included in the deal.
Thanks.
Yeah. So they would be in breach of the agreement by removing that.
Okay, cool.
Existing integrated phone systems, home automation systems, okay, and home automation systems. So that would be considered a home automation system. Softwares, permissions, and passwords are defaulted as included in the transaction. So it can be negotiated out. If the seller really wants to keep his nest, he can specify that in the agreement that he's going to keep it. But if he doesn't, it defaults that those items are included in the transaction. Okay, paragraph 8. Leased or liened items, seller must disclose within 7 days if any of the components in the house are leased or liened. Seller must deliver written materials, leases, or other information. If the buyer is anticipated or expected to assume those leases, they need to provide that information for the buyer to remove, and it is a buyer contingency. So it is part of the transaction. If those items are not provided, okay, and let's say there are leased items and all contingencies are removed, late in the transaction, that could be an out for a buyer, that they could say, well, you never delivered the information regarding those leases. And that could be an out for them to be able to cancel the transaction and reactivate that contingency. So be careful with that one. Seller in the next sentence verifies that all else that is not listed above is owned by the seller, and they warrant that. It's important you have these conversations with the seller because a lot of times they don't really think about it. You know, if it's a propane tank, for example, in certain areas, propane tanks for the most part are leased items. Okay, it's typically the property owner doesn't own that propane tank, so it could be something like that, or some other component of the house that might be under some type of a lease agreement, maybe an alarm system. Okay, they need to identify those things, and that's a question you need to be asking when you're taking a listing. Are there any things here that you pay a lease for? Because you need to make sure that they have that information and they provide it within that defaulted time period for the seller to provide their disclosures. Items excluded from the sale would be audio and video components, unless it's attached directly to the property. Furniture secured to protect against an earthquake. Brackets stay with the property unless the checkbox says that they will be removed and patched and not painted. So remember, brackets remain with the property because they're bolted to. The electronic items that are attached to those brackets can be removed if they're not negotiated into the deal. Paragraph 9, closing in possession. The buyer certifies whether or not they intend to occupy as a primary residence. This is also important, okay? It can get certain people in trouble when they're trying to deal with their financing contingency. If they are intending to purchase the property as a primary residence and they're going for the type of financing that it is a primary residence type financing, and the checkbox is not checkmarked that they are going to occupy as a primary residence, or for some reason they don't get the financing or they're unable to do that, then oftentimes they can't use that financing contingency to cancel the transaction. So just be accurate with that, okay? If it's going to be a primary residence, if they're going to live there, then they need to check that box and be straight up about that. Seller occupied or vacant property shall be delivered to the buyer at 6 p.m. or some other time agreed upon on the date of the close of escrow. There is a provision to allow for some other time period other than the close of escrow. And we'll talk about the seller remaining in the property in the first paragraph on page 4. So we'll discuss how you handle it if the seller is going to remain in possession. Paragraph 9, seller remaining in property. So we're now on page 4. Okay, so that we've moved over to page 4. Seller remaining in the property after the closing is advised to use the CAR form SIP if it's less than 30 days. Okay, so if they're going to be in for another 7 days or something like that, you would use the SIP document, and you use the RLAS if it's greater than 30 days. Okay, and the RLAS mimics more of a lease agreement because of the time period that's involved. The SIP is a much more abbreviated agreement that is not quite as formal. Sorry, my voice is going a little wacky. Buyer and seller are advised to consult with insurance and lender to understand any impact there might be with the seller remaining in the property after close of escrow. We've had transactions where the insurances get overlapped. The seller cancels their insurance, but they're still living in the property. And let's say there's some damage that's done to the property that could create potential liability, or there could be insurance issues with regard to it being a tenant occupied property, because that's what it is after the close of escrow. So they're advised in the paragraph to make sure that they check to make sure that there isn't any issue with regard. There probably won't be with their lender, but with the insurance company, there could be some issues that could arise. Let's say there's a fire 5 days in and the seller's still in the property, type of a thing. For tenant occupied, it's agreed upon that the tenant will be out at least 5 days prior to the close of escrow unless separately agreed upon. If the tenant is to remain in the property, they use the form TIP, is the form that's used for that. So that's another tricky one, right? The buyer has the right to investigate the property and have the property vacant from the tenant 5 days prior to the close of escrow. And sometimes that doesn't happen, and that can cause some problems down the road. So just be aware that the seller is agreeing that they are going to make sure that that tenant is out 5 days prior to the close of escrow. At closing, seller assigns all warranty rights for things included in the sale. Seller will furnish copies of any warranties. And there's also language in there that talks about the fact that those things are delivered. In other words, the seller, there may be a warranty from the manufacturer, but the seller is delivering them without warranty. Okay, so they're not guaranteeing that whatever's left there or whatever's included in the transaction is going to work for any time period after the close of escrow. Paragraph 9, at closing, seller shall provide buyer all keys, passwords, codes to operate locks, mailbox keys, security system alarms, home automation systems, and connected devices included in the sale, also garage door openers. Buyers advise that if it's an HOA, they may have to purchase keys to common area facilities. So if there, a lot of times if there's a homeowners association and there's gates, let's say there's a gate opener at Cedar Ridge, for example, the buyer may not provide, there may be a deposit, okay? They may not own the gate code key. Cedar Ridge does. I mean, you have to buy the gate code openers, but there may be keys that are leased or openers that are leased. And this is just telling the buyer that the seller may not provide those items. They may have to contact the homeowners association to purchase those items. Paragraph 10, statutory and other disclosures and cancellation rights, seller shall provide within 7 days the lead disclosures, TDS, NHD, and SBQ unless exempt. So there are some exemptions. We all know that certain types of trusts, probate sales, bank-owned properties, they're exempt from the TDS, and there's a document that they will utilize, and we'll talk a little bit later about that in the agreement. But the number one thing here is that the obligation of the seller is to provide all of those disclosures, okay, within the 7-day period. And we talked about the SBQ, we talked about the TDS previously, about the fact that the TDS is not complete until the AVID is attached, if that is checked and the agent is using that, which all of our agents are. So that also means that within the 7-day period, the agent's under the obligation as well, per the contract, to provide that agent's visual. So that should accompany the TDS so that that document is complete. Otherwise, it's not complete, okay? And I'll point out that that's the listing agent's AVID. The buyer's agent's AVID and the buyer's agent signing of the TDS is not part of the completion of those disclosures. And we've talked about that before when we discussed the TDS. Otherwise, the buyer could drag their feet and they could extend that time period for the contingency based on the fact that incomplete documents are being provided. So just remember that it's good for the buyer's agent to do it immediately as well, but it doesn't hold anything up, and the document is considered complete once the seller has completed their portion and the listing agent has signed it and provided their agent's visual. So they have 7 days to do that unless it's defaulted to otherwise. Paragraph 10 talks about disclosures. there's an explanation regarding what is complete. And I just talked to you about what complete is, okay? A document is complete if the seller answered all questions. If the seller misses 2 or 3 questions on the TDS, it's incomplete, okay? And it can cause a ability for a buyer to not remove their contingencies, okay? They have the ability to forestall the removal of contingencies because the documents are not, all the questions haven't been answered, or it hasn't been signed by the seller, and the brokerage hasn't completed and signed their section, including the AVID, as we talked about. Advice to buyer, there's also advice to buyers, brokers to complete their visual inspection, but the TDS is complete without it. There's a waiver of statutory disclosures by, waiver of statutory disclosures by either party is prohibited by law. So if a buyer says, well, I don't really care about the TDS, tells your agent, I don't really care, I don't care if they provide me with the TDS or not, they're not allowed to do that, okay? They can't waive the fact that they don't want to receive them. It is required by law that they are provided and received. Seller has 7 days to provide the SPQ. If the seller is exempt from providing a TDS, they will provide within 7 days the exempt seller disclosure. So let's say you have a trust situation where they say, they notify you right up front that they're not going to provide you with an SPQ. That doesn't prevent them from having to make disclosure, but because anything they do know about the property, they have to disclose. But it does prevent them, or it does allow them the latitude to not complete the TDS, because in most instances, they don't have much knowledge of the property. And it's likely that it's going to be an incomplete disclosure regardless. So what you as a buyer's agent would be looking for within that 7-day period, if they don't provide the TDS and they say they're not going to provide one because they're exempt, is that they provide you the ESD document. So the exempt seller disclosure, which is a requirement. That is something that is required within the contract. Continue on with disclosures. Buyer will, within 17 days, unless otherwise agreed, return the signed copies of the provided disclosures. So the buyer's obligation, once the seller provides everything, is they have 17 days to review them and sign acknowledgement of receipt of those disclosures. If there's new information, okay, that's materially affecting the property, it's got to be promptly, subsequently disclosed in writing. So there needs to be a supplement. You could use an addendum, but it's a supplement to the TDS making the new disclosure, okay? So a new disclosure, so new information that is materially affecting the property, if it's discovered by the buyer, okay, they find something that wasn't disclosed by the seller, and the only reason the seller wouldn't disclose it is because they didn't know about it, okay? But let's say that the buyer discloses it, new disclosure is not required or not needed. So if it's uncovered by a home inspection performed on behalf of the buyers, or if it's information that the buyer just finds out about, then you don't have to go through the formal process of issuing a supplement to the TDS to disclose that new information. The buyer has 3 days after a subsequent disclosure to cancel the agreement if delivered in person, and 5 days if mailed or delivered electronically. So let's say all contingencies are removed and you're 28 days into the transaction and the seller realizes that there's something that came up that they should have disclosed that they didn't disclose. And they tell their agent and they create an addendum to supplement the TDS. Remember, all contingencies are removed. They provide that supplemental disclosure with the new information to the buyer. That reopens the contingency, okay? They have 5 days if it's mailed or delivered electronically. They have 3 days if it's delivered in person to either approve that subsequent disclosure or they can cancel the agreement. So it creates another opportunity or a window for a buyer to be able to back out and utilize the inspection contingency to do so. So it's very important to make sure that when you're preparing those documents and those disclosures as a seller, that you make sure they're complete, okay? And the SPQ really helps us with that. It goes into much more detail. When it was just the TDS alone, we ran into problems where sellers' memories weren't jogged quite as effectively as it is now when we use that SPQ. More disclosures. The natural and environmental hazard disclosures must be provided within 7 days. They'll deliver the earthquake guide, environmental hazards booklet, home energy rating pamphlet, and other potential hazard zones. All of these are fulfilled by providing the NHD. So it's not something that you need to be overly concerned about. You need to make sure that the NHD is being delivered and in the works. Seller shall have 7 days to satisfy the FERPTA. So there's a requirement that the seller handle the FERPTA, which is handled through Escrow. There's a disclosure there regarding Megan's Law, and the Megan's Law database is disclosed in the contract, and it's advised that the buyer do their own investigations. It is not advised for you as an agent to go in and search the Megan's Law database, and we're not required to do so. And I recommend that you don't go in and look at the Megan's Law database on behalf of your owner. There's disclosures regarding gas and hazardous liquid transmission pipelines, where to get information and where to get maps for that. That is another thing that really isn't applicable in our areas. Last of page 4, paragraph 10 disclosures. There are condo and PUD disclosures. Seller has 7 days to disclose if it is a condo or a PUD, and they do that via the SPQ or the ESD. So again, the seller is required to disclose if it is a condo or if there is a planned unit development with a homeowners association, so that the buyer can do the appropriate investigations on that. Okay, page 5, still on disclosures. Condo and PUD disclosures, seller must request within 3 days copies of all documents required by law, disclosures of any pending or expected claim or litigation against the association, statement regarding location and number of parking and storage spaces, copies of 12 months most recent minutes, names and contact info for all HOA governing the property, private transfer fees, pet fee restrictions, smoking restrictions, seller to provide all common interest disclosures and approval by the buyer, and they are a contingency of this deal. And it goes on to say that the seller will deposit money in escrow to pay for the HOA management company to provide the above. This becomes a point of contention sometimes because these HOA, all of these disclosures, all of this whole page of what I just told you is handled by the management company, typically through escrow. You as an agent typically aren't involved with this. It's something that escrow handles on your behalf. And what they do is the seller has to cut a check to Mark's management or whoever it is that is the management company handling the homeowners association. And sometimes it's a hefty number. Does anybody know, like for Cedar Ridge, what the HOA, like what is all this documentation? What is it? What do we pay Mark's management?
Steve, I just had an escrow that closed on a condo, and it was $425 just to request.
Yeah.
And that was a 7 to 10 day
Right.
period to get the information. And then we needed to close faster than that. So I had to go over and pay an additional $200 just to get them to expedite.
Yeah.
This. So it's a highway robbery, I feel.
It's a big number, and the sellers don't want to do it. Okay, I'll tell you, most of the time they don't want to deal with this. And when you run into that situation, you have to point out, okay, if you're a buyer's agent and you're getting pushback from the listing agent that the seller didn't agree to that, this is where it is. Okay, and you can point to it in the contract that the seller is under obligation first to request within 3 days all this stuff, because as Susan just said, it takes time to get it all, right? So the seller's under an obligation to provide all this stuff within 7 days with all their other disclosures, okay? And if they don't request it right away, let's say they wait and it takes 7 to 10 days to get it from the homeowners association management company, you're already behind the 8 ball, okay? And you're not able to comply with your timeframes. The second part of it is the seller's authorizing right here, last sentence in this page, the seller will deposit money in escrow to pay for the HOA management company to provide the above. So when they say that they're not going to do it or they're not going to provide it, they've agreed to it in the contract, and they are in breach of contract if they don't provide it. Paragraph 11, condition of property. Unless otherwise agreed, the property is sold in its present condition as of the date of acceptance, subject to the buyer's inspection rights. This is another common misconception, that buyers believe that sellers are required to do something to fix certain things. It says in black and white, actually in blue and white, okay, but black and white on the contract, that the property is sold in its as-is present condition, and the seller's not required to do anything. They're not required to fix health and safety things. They're not required to do anything. The property is as it goes unless it's negotiated differently, okay? And it goes on to say that it's subject to the buyer's inspection rights. That means that the buyer has the right to inspect, okay? It also goes on to say that it is to be maintained in substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance. So if you look at the property and it's in fair condition, you go to do your final walkthrough and there are holes in the drywall, that is not substantially in the same condition. Or if the toilets have been removed, or if something else material, if there's the floors a little, if it's dirty, or if there could be a gray area with regard to what does substantially mean. But at the end of the day, it means that it needs to be in very similar condition to when they negotiated the deal. Another big one, all debris and personal property not included shall be removed by the close of escrow. Some sellers think that they can just leave their garbage, okay? They're in breach of contract. And if they leave all their garbage and they're unwilling to remove the stuff, and the buyer has to pay $500 to have somebody come and haul away their stuff, guess what? The buyer goes to small claims, they provide the contract and the proof that they paid the $500, and they're gonna get a judgment against the seller. It says in the contract, all the debris and all that stuff needs to be removed. Within 7 days, a seller will disclose known material facts and defects, including known insurance claims within the last 5 years. This is a big one that people forget. Okay, they forget to disclose that there was an insurance claim on a property. Fortunately, the new insurance companies are running clue reports, and they're pulling up this information. There's a database that shares all this information, so it normally gets caught. But it is a requirement of the seller to disclose if they did have some type of a insurance claim. Now, if they've only owned it 3 years, and the previous owner had an insurance claim 2 years ago that was disclosed to them, are they required to disclose it? Yeah, they are, and they'll forget about that. And if it comes up and it gets missed and it isn't disclosed, it can be a point of liability for that seller. Whenever we have a situation where we get a complaint or we have a potential lawsuit, I always pull up, and normally in every instance it's non-disclosure. Okay, in almost every instance, the new buyer says that the seller didn't tell them something, and so the first thing we do is we review the TDS and the SPQ to see what they disclosed, and the next thing that I do is I pull the transaction file if we did the deal prior to that, or I ask the seller if they have the disclosure paperwork from the previous transaction, because that will surface, that's going to come out. And it's a good idea when you are having the seller complete their disclosures, this is a side note, to ask them if they have the disclosure paperwork from the previous transaction, or provide it to them if you know that we did the deal. And so it will help them complete those disclosures and make sure that they don't miss those things. Because a lot of times, this one, for example, if you've got a 3-year owner and there was a insurance claim 4 years ago with a previous owner, they're not intentionally missing that. They're not thinking about it because they didn't do it, and they'll miss it. Okay, paragraph 11, condition of property. Buyer has the right to conduct buyer investigations and may, based on those investigations, either cancel the agreement, or they can request that the seller take some action. Okay, they can request that they do repairs. Please don't, if you're representing a buyer, please don't give a request for repairs and provide a home inspection report and ask the seller to fix everything that's on the home inspection report. Okay, please don't do that. That is not a professional way to conduct this. If a buyer insists that you do that, then you need to go through the process of itemizing those items, because that is not a good practice. And if you receive something like that from another agent, you need to insist that they provide the request for repairs and be specific about the items that they want repaired. Not allow them to just say, fix everything that's on this home inspection report, because oftentimes there are going to be conditions that are suggested by a home inspector that really there's no fix, and you can't fix it. They're noting something about the property, and that can cause problems down the road because the buyer is going to expect that item be resolved and fixed when it really can't be. There's bold print. Buyer is strongly advised to investigate the entire property in order to determine its present condition. Seller may not be aware of all defects affecting the property or other factors that the buyer may deem important. The seller may not have any idea that noise is that this new buyer has a hypersensitivity to noise. And so they might not disclose something. We had a school noise lawsuit that was I've mentioned it before to most of you, where it was a big deal. I mean, it was a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that we actually went to trial on because the buyer alleged that they had this hypersensitivity to school noise, and this property was adjacent a school. And so what affects one person may not affect another. So a seller may not disclose it, not because they're trying to hide anything, but because it isn't something that they felt was important, or it never bothered them. Some improvements may not be to code, compliant with the law, or permitted. So there's just additional disclosure and warning to the buyer that they need to make sure that they're checking everything, and that the property may not be to current code. Paragraph 12, buyer's investigation of property. The buyer investigation is a contingency of the deal. Buyer has the right to do the inspections within the 17 days. Within a 17-day contingency period or extension if agreed upon. So that means they need to do their inspections within 17 days. It'll say later on in the agreement that outside of that 17-day period, they're not permitted to do inspections. Okay, they're not permitted to investigate the property further unless there's some latitude, unless you grant them additional time. The paragraph goes on to describe and suggest the types of inspections that can be conducted. Reference is made in the agreement to the BIA. Buyer without consent will not make invasive or destructive inspections or have any governmental inspections done unless required by law. We've had multiple transactions where the buyer has contacted the building inspector and asked them to come out as part of their inspection process and do what's called a pre-alt inspection to take a look at the property. And we've had instances where the county has discovered that there is unpermitted areas or areas that are not in compliance with the county laws. And the transaction cancels, and then all of a sudden the county is sicked on the seller. And so there are restrictions about contacting government agencies regarding properties. And you're not allowed to do that unless you contact the seller and ask for their permission to do so. The seller is required to make the property available for all investigations. We run into this a little bit where sellers are reluctant, or they, let's say somebody wants to do a survey and then they want to do a home inspection and then they want to do a septic inspection. Let's say they have 4 or 5 different inspections that they want to do on the property. And let's say they're living there and they become sort of belligerent about the fact that they're not going to allow all these inspections to happen. Well, the contract specifically states that whatever inspections that the buyer wants to make, the seller has to cooperate with that during the time period, during that 17 days. Paragraph 12, buyer's investigation of the property. Seller shall make the investigations, buyer shall make investigations within the 17 days and either remove the contingency or cancel the agreement. Buyer must give the seller at no cost complete copies of any reports from the investigations. This obligation shall survive termination of the agreement. So if they do a home inspection and they decide they're going to cancel the transaction and they've moved on and the deal gets canceled and the seller comes back and requests that the buyer provide them with a copy of the home inspection, they're entitled to get a copy of it. And they're in breach of agreement. The seller could sue in small claims court for the cost of that inspection if it's not provided. Seller shall have the water, electricity, and gas, as well as operable pilots on for the buyer's inspections and through possession. Sometimes they turn all that stuff off, right? They're agreeing that they're going to have all of those components operable during the time of inspections and until the close of escrow. Paragraph 12, buyer investigation of property. Buyer indemnity and seller protection for entry of the property. Buyer shall keep the property free and clear of any liens. That should say liens, not liens. Repair all damage. Oops, sorry. Sorry, guys. Any liens, repair all damage arising from buyer investigations, indemnify and hold the seller harmless from resulting liability claims. Buyer shall require anyone acting on behalf to have liability insurance, workman's comp, and defending and protecting the seller for any claim arising from the inspection process. So basically they're saying, look, you're hiring, you, Mr. Buyer, are hiring this person to work on your behalf. You need to verify that they have all these things. Now, if they're using one of our recommended home inspectors, then they're going to have those things because we check for those things to make sure that they have, or if it's necessary for them to have. If he's a one-man show, he's not required to have workman's comp, but he is required to have liability claims. So this is saying that if the guy falls off the roof, the buyer is going to accept the responsibility and the liability for that happening. Okay, moving on, out of inspection of properties. Paragraph 13 talks about title investing. The seller will provide a preliminary title report within 7 days. We're running up against some issues with that because sometimes the title companies are not able to provide it within that 7-day period. But that is what the contract says. Approval of that prelim is a contingency of the agreement. Okay, so that is a contingency that needs to be removed by the buyer. The title company is instructed to do a general index of all sellers except banks or institutional lenders to determine if there are any matters that affect title. What a general index is just a search. So they'll search and they ask for, down below here I say, the seller agrees in this paragraph to complete a statement of information within 7 days. So the statement of information is an escrow document that's provided to the seller, and the title company uses it to do the general index, the search. So they search the area and they search surrounding counties based on the information that is in that statement of information. And if you've seen one, you know that it has their name, has their previous residences, where they've lived before for the last 10 years, aliases, any other names they've gone by, maiden names, all that personal information is provided to the title company so they can do the appropriate search on all of the sellers to make sure that there aren't any liens that may pop up. And so that is, again, when the statement of information is provided and the seller gets the document, sometimes they'll balk at it. They don't want to provide all that information. Well, they've agreed to in the contract. They've agreed to, they will complete it and they will provide it within the 7-day period to escrow. Title is taken subject to all encumbrances, easements, covenants, conditions, restrictions, rights, and other matters, whether of record or not. Very important. They're taking title whether it is a matter of record or not as of the date of acceptance, except for monetary liens the seller is required to pay that the buyer is not assuming, or those items that the seller has agreed to remove in writing. So what are those things? Okay, encumbrances, easements, covenants, and conditions. Those are like utility easements, could be the private road easement that is adjacent to the property, could be CC&Rs. And basically, you're going to see on your title report a list of all these items, anything that is encumbering the title of that property. And we as agents review those title insurance policies, or excuse me, the prelims, and the seller also reviews it and signs off on the fact that they are willing to accept it with whatever items that are on there. Could be easements, could be a encroachment easement, where half the neighbor's property is located on that particular property. That's where those things are going to show up. And it's saying that the title is going to be taken subject to that. Okay, even though there's an encroachment easement and the property is encroaching into the property, or the home is encroaching in the property, the buyer is accepting it. Okay, and the seller is not going to remedy that unless they agree to otherwise. Now, what's the difference between of record and not of record? Well, again, there could be a verbal agreement. Okay, there's let's say an agreement for someone to use a portion of the property, the neighbor to use a portion of the property for a driveway. And the seller has to disclose that, okay? But it's not a matter of record. Let's say they never recorded it with the county, but it still exists. So that's an example of something that would be not of record, but it is a known entity. Now, if the transaction closes and the neighbor comes over and says, oh, by the way, I have a written agreement with the previous owner that I'm allowed to use this driveway, then the buyer has a completely different situation on their hands. They've got a non-disclosure item where they then would have to go back and seek remedy from the seller for non-disclosure. But if he's told it, and after the fact he wants to not, he wants to raise the issue with it because it's not a matter of record, he doesn't have the ability to do that. How are we doing on time? We're at 2:49. Okay, so let me just keep going through this. Paragraph 13. Man, that time goes fast on this stuff. Paragraph 13, title investing. Seller must disclose all matters affecting title within the 7-day disclosure period, whether of record or not. So that would be an example of driveway across the property. They need to tell the buyer that. If they tell them, or let's say they find out about it after the fact, it could open up that contingency period. Buyer will receive at close of escrow a grant deed. This paragraph discloses that what manner title is taken matters, and it can have legal and tax consequences. So they're advised at that point that they need to think about title, how they're going to take title, because it is something that's important. Buyer shall receive a CLTA or ALTA, homeowner's policy of title insurance, at the close of escrow, or be notified by escrow that they will not. Title companies are the best resource regarding questions regarding coverage. There may be, I haven't really run into too many situations where a title policy can't be issued. We'll have a session with Ira where he can talk to us a little bit more about the difference between CLTA and ALTA policies. I'm not going to go into that here, but the important thing to know is that it is an expectation, and it is defaulted in the contract that the buyer will receive one, or if they aren't, they're going to be notified by escrow that it can't be provided. Is that the end of page 5? Yeah, that's the end of page 5. Okay, so I am out of time for this. We'll pick up page 6 on the next session. Is there any questions or anything that anybody would like to add to the page 3, 4, and 5 that we just covered?
Steve, I have one quick question.
Yes.
This is Pat. On the NHD, things like that type of disclosure, we do not get those. The agents don't generate it. It comes from escrow.
Correct.
And that's normally toward the very end. So is that anything for us to have to worry about?
Well, I mean, technically it needs to be provided. Those disclosures need to be provided within that 7-day period. I haven't run into a situation where we've had a buyer challenge that. That's something I'm going to talk with Escrow to see if that can be, if that process can be expedited. I don't know exactly when Escrow gets that acknowledgement that the buyer has received that.
And then when we get the actual report, do you suggest as agents, we pull out that one page that needs signatures on and get it signed right then?
Well,
Or do we wait till the end of escrow and get it coming from escrow?
that's a good question, Pat. Let me ask Escrow about that.
Okay.
Because that could potentially, it hasn't happened, but it could potentially be an issue where someone could challenge that they did not receive those disclosures timely. Receiving the receipt, having the signature from the buyer is not a requirement. Okay, we do that because we want to prove that they've received it, but it's actually the delivery. So they're required to deliver those things. And when the contingency is removed, okay, which typically it's all lumped together, you're not necessarily removing the environmental disclosure contingency. You're removing the inspection contingency. So the buyers oftentimes remove that, not necessarily knowing whether or not they've received. As long as they've received it within the 17-day period, we should be good to go. But as far as the signature, we do it because we want to make sure that they acknowledge receipt, but it's not a requirement.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
Steve, this is
Comments?
Gada.
What's that?
This is Gada. Hi, Steve.
I got it.
Hi. Some good news. We just funded on one of my transactions and closed escrow. So some good news today.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Hoping for the next two.
That's awesome. That's
All right.
awesome. And just as a side note, everyone else can hear this too, but the notice to perform on them removing contingencies has gone out. I'm going to be following up this afternoon with a phone call to that other agent,
Okay.
telling him that they need to do that, or we're going to potentially cancel that deal.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Have a good one. We'll pick
You
up
too.
page 6 in the next session.
All right.
Thanks, Steve. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Have a great day.
Okay, guys.